Back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, September 16th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Nebraska and a brand new poll out of the state showing Dan Osborne ahead of Pete Ricketts in a 2026 Senate matchup. A very, very, very interesting poll that really does take me by surprise, even though we knew that Dan Osborne would be a formidable candidate against Pete Ricketts in the 2026 year. Pete Ricketts, who I do believe stands to be in a better position than Deb Fischer going into this race, has found himself underwater in the most recent survey from the state of Nebraska, which makes me believe that Pete Ricketts could not be ahead by more than 5 to 6 points across this state. Now, this is a Democratic internal poll, or I guess not necessarily a Democratic internal poll. It's an internal that's done that likely benefits Dan Osborne and props up his numbers just a few percentage points. But oftentimes these internal polls, while maybe slightly off in terms of who might be leading, it is very shocking nonetheless. And the reason why I say that is because I thought that this race would be a race won by Pete Ricketts by about 11 to 12 points. Unlike the 2024 race against Deb Fischer, Pete Ricketts is not an unpopular and lesser-known senator, nor does he look like he is taking this race for granted. In 2024, however, Deb Fischer very much was. When the race was initially declared to be more competitive, Republicans didn't believe it. Deb Fischer felt like she was in a very strong position, and she had every reason to think that. In 2024, Donald Trump did win the state by 21 percentage points. But in the Senate race, it was eventually won by incumbent Republican Deb Fischer by just 6 points, a margin that isn't all that impressive, underperforming relative to President Trump by a massive, massive amount, and the data leading up to the election had indicated that this race was going to be competitive. It was a lack of preparation and a lack of visibility that made Deb Fischer more vulnerable across the state and had Republicans rushing tens of millions of dollars to defend her in the final stages of the campaign season. Had they not come through, there's a very real chance that Dan Osborne would have been elected to the U.S. Senate. Thinking about what that actually would mean in this state, Nebraska is one, again, that has been historically very conservative. In the coinciding Senate election, the reason why I believed Pete Ricketts to be in a good position is because Pete Ricketts, who was appointed to fill this role after Ben Sasse went down to be president of the University of Florida, leaving the U.S. Senate for that role, Pete Ricketts won with 63% of the vote, outperforming Donald Trump and winning across the state by 26 percentage points. Keep in mind, Donald Trump won this state in the 2024 election by just 21. And so on the, comparative point here, Pete Ricketts, who's outpacing Trump by 5, and Deb Fischer, who's underperforming Trump by 15, very obviously, you'd think in 2026 that up against the candidate who's already outpacing Trump, that Dan Osborne would not be in a competitive range. And that's what I thought, and that's what many of us did too. Now, the initial data did say that it was very much a statistical tie. People are still angry at the Republican Party, and who better to channel that energy than Dan Osborne, who's not a Democrat, who has long been a registered independent, who has promised he would not caucus with the Democrats or Republicans if elected into the United States Senate, and that he would deny any committee assignments, that he would be there to advocate for his state, to which many voters very much do believe in him. There are thousands upon thousands of voters in Nebraska that voted for Trump in this election. Kamala Harris only received 369,000 votes in Nebraska. Then taking a look at the Senate race, we saw here, this is the special, but in the election here, Dan Osborne received 436,000, meaning that there are roughly nearly 100,000 people who did not vote for Kamala Harris that voted for Dan Osborne, especially when you take into account the amount of people that just vote for president. That is a big deal. And thinking about what this most recent data point is telling us, again, it is a internal poll for, Dan Osborne in this race. But it is one that is quite telling. And it is one that does tell us that pretty much at baseline, looking at, where they are when it comes down to the Senate race, when it comes down to this, what is not really meant to be a competitive race, Dan Osborne is outperforming expectations. Because Pete Ricketts, unlike Deb Fischer, is much more visible. He's a senator from Nebraska, but not to mention that he was governor from 2015 to 2023. First elected in 2014 by a massive margin, re-elected in 2018 by nearly the same margin. Nebraska knows Pete Ricketts, and Pete Ricketts knows Nebraska. But voters may not like what they know. And it may not help that Pete Ricketts, who is serving in the United States Senate, faces a lot of the same baggage against, Dan Osborne. Someone who's a wealthier businessman. People look at him and say that he is someone who, is in this position because of his wealth and an association with a billionaire family. These are things that very much do have the ability to really latch on to voters in a very negative way. But Pete Ricketts, I did adamantly believe. I thought he would be in a position where he could actually overcome that because he had served as governor of this state. But what Dan Osborne is proving yet again, and I think we underestimated him in 2024, and we are likely underestimating him in 2026, is that given the circumstances of 2026, this data should be very terrifying to Pete Ricketts because it is roughly a year before the election, and there isn't much room for growth on the Republican side if you are finding a sample that 47% of the state wants Dan Osborne when compared to Pete Ricketts. Looking at where we are, looking at this data, I am honestly very shocked. And I do think that Republicans are going to have to now invest money in this race when they otherwise would have never even had to think about it if Dan Osborne was not running. Because that's the other side of this. Democrats are likely not going to be in a position where they can convince Dan Osborne to agree to caucus with them in the U.S. Senate, and if anything, that would doom him in a Senate bid or in any future re-election bid. Him staying as an independent is probably the best thing he can do coming from a Republican state, because this is not a case of Vermont where you have an independent who aligns with the party that wins it on the presidential level. This is a state where you were going up against the political party that always wins it on the presidential level. You will not find, in recent memory, the last time Democrats won Nebraska on the presidential level, unless you go all the way back to 1964. Was the last time that Nebraska voted blue. So you're certainly not finding it as an appealing factor for Dan Osborne to caucus with the Democratic Party, and I really don't think that he will. But taking a look at where we are, taking a look at, the Senate polling that we've seen, Osborne being ahead by 1 point is going to throw a wrench in the plans of the mainstream GOP and where they are focusing on when it comes down to the 2026 midterms. Because they know that in the 26 cycle, the races they will have to focus on, let's actually get over to it so I can show you visually, but the races they will have to focus on in 2026, they already know. States like Ohio, where Sherrod Brown is running again and John Huston won't be as locked in as they would have hoped. In a state like North Carolina, where there is a retiring Republican incumbent and Michael Whatley, the RNC chair, is the presumptive Republican nominee against a popular Democratic gov. In a state like Maine, where Susan Collins is facing a real challenger from Graham Plattner and the possibility of Janet Mills, the incumbent Democratic governor, running against her in 2026. Ashley Hinson in the state of Iowa, Ken Paxton in the state of Texas, Ashley Moody in the state of Florida. The list goes on and on. But adding in Nebraska into the fray, I don't think Republicans were hoping to do. I don't think they were looking at this and saying, this is good for us. Because it isn't. Because what it tells them is that, like what we saw in 2024, in that election, we can take a look, the amount of money that was spent was not so great for the GOP. And the amount of outside dollars spent, too, also goes to show that it got worse for Republicans. Deb Fischer raised and spent $8 million. If we want to think about a comparable race in the 2024 cycle, thinking about how much money needs to be raised, let's look up in North Dakota, where Kevin Cramer was in this position. And, based on what we've seen, wasn't all that impressive. But $5 million raised, but just 2.3 spent in the election. Why might that be? Well, the honest answer is you don't need to spend money in a race that you know you're going to win. You can save that for a future re-election bid. Now, Kevin Cramer, who knew competitive races and had fundraised a lot of money before, went on to win that election in 2018, but in 2024 certainly did not need it. And thinking about where Democrats are when it comes down to a state like Nebraska, they obviously do not have a fighting chance in their own right. But based off what we've seen with Dan Osborne, he very much does have a chance. And it isn't the first time that an independent has run for office, hoping to win in a race like this. In Utah in 2022, Evan McMullin ran against Mike Lee as an independent who was allianced with the Democratic Party. Maybe had he ran, just as a strictly independent and rejected the Democratic endorsement and they went elsewhere, the race might have looked differently. But this took a state that Donald Trump won by 20 points in 2020, 2016, 2024, and narrowed it up to being an 11-point race in what was meant to be a very strong year for the GOP. An 11-point race in favor of Mike Lee, but Evan McMullin really narrowed it up. And likewise to this Senate race, especially given that 2026 will be a very good year for the Democratic Party, there's a non-zero chance that this data does end up becoming reality. That Dan Osborne somehow ekes by in a race because voters are so upset with the current state of the Republican Party and thinking about the last Senate cycle. Again, this is why I've been really hesitant to think that Dan Osborne would go any further than where he was in 2024, and why I honestly thought that Pete Ricketts would be ahead by 12, which is that it actually isn't that difficult to shift the 2024 map and see how Democrats would do in 2026 in a state like this one. Because when you take a look at 2024 and you edit the margin and shift it in favor of the Democratic Party by 7 points, so taking Trump plus 1.5 on the national level and turning it into what would be, in essence, Democrats winning the popular vote by 5.5%. For context, in 2018, Democrats won the popular vote by 8.4%. Let's give them on the lower bounds of just 5.5%. Nebraska swings and switches over in favor of the Democrats. And so does Ohio, when Sherrod Brown was on the ticket, and so did Pennsylvania, where you saw Bob Casey on that race too, but not a competitive Pennsylvania race this time. It's not even up in this cycle. But the point is that in Nebraska, what this exposed was that had the national environment been similar to that of Biden in 2020 when he won by 4.5, let's say Harris had a 1 point overperformance relative to Biden, Nebraska would likely have elected Dan Osborne to be the next U.S. Senator from the state. And so if 2026 really is much more lopsided in favor of the Democratic Party, there's a very real chance that that is the outcome. Pete Ricketts is the favorite. But what I think this poll exposed, and what I think this data has pretty consistently exposed in this state, that Dan Osborne is far closer than we think. And counting him out at our own risk is something we should not do, because what we have seen, I think pretty consistently, is that he knows how to outperform, and he knows how to take a race that should be so far in favor of the GOP and really, really narrow it up. And like I said, if 2026 ends up being this much better year for the Democratic Party than 2024, there's a very real possibility that Dan Osborne wins this race. Because this poll really served as a reality check, as has all the other data points, and arguably too, the emerging focus on Nebraska that Republicans will have will only confirm this belief. Because they will read the writing on the wall and they will see that this could be one of those races, like in 2024, they were caught sleeping, but were carried across the finish line by an impressive victory by a Republican nominee for president. But in 2026, they very well may not have that. And it could be Dan Osborne that shows them up of all the states to do it. Nebraska would probably be the one they least expect, but now arguably might be one of the ones that is more likely than it was before, and could really put Republicans in a jeopardizing position going into 2028 and beyond. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.